Hello and welcome back to the Energy Flux podcast. I'm your host, Seb Kennedy, founder of Energy Flux, and I'm joined by my energy news hound podcasting partner, Victor Ponsford. Vic, how are you doing? What's going on?
I'm good. I had a nice break over Easter and then have got back and just got stuck into it again. And it is even more fascinating than it was before Easter. There's so much that's happened. There's so much going on. It's all so complex and confusing. And I'm really glad we're doing this pod to talk it all through.
Yeah, I feel the same. I think I went away over Easter, but it feels like ancient history. And I was even working nights to keep on top of crazy market machinations. But I must highlight that the beginning and end of all the conversations about the Strait of Hormuz and the energy markets is how many vessels have gone through that strait. And when we're looking just at the LNG space, well, it's still zero. You know, that for me, that's the kind of the most important data point that seems to be maybe overlooked in all of this. And with all the price machinations, which we'll probably get into discussing, it's still, the strait is still closed. And no matter how much high level talk there is about it, the strait is still closed. So we're probably going to spend most of the show talking about Hormuz. And just to put in a placeholder, we're recording this on the 21st of April, and there are high-level talks supposedly in the works, right, Vic? What's the latest on those?
I mean, at the moment, it's not even clear if the Iranian negotiators are going to go to Islamabad to meet with JD Vance. So I think everything is still very much up in the air, although of course there are reports that there are vehicles moving around furiously, some sort of shuttle diplomacy going on, but it remains super opaque, super vague. The US president is talking up the chances of there being a deal, but he's also said that the Iranians don't have a choice but to accept a great deal. Meanwhile, the Iranians aren't even sure they want to go. So I think everything's still up in the air.
And that's just casting this enormous prolonged pall of uncertainty over energy markets. And we've talked in previous episodes about how the market is completely struggling and mostly failing to really capture, and it's impossible really for a single price to capture the kind of broad delta of potential pathways for how this could evolve. Will there be an extension of the ceasefire? Yes or not? Under what terms? Could there be an actual mini peace deal of some description that allows both sides to buy time? Or could it all collapse and we go back to kinetic hot war again? And obviously all the implications of that.
Yeah, it's interesting to see how a ceasefire has seen an extension of this kind of tit for tat dynamic. So you had the seizure of a ship yesterday by the US military. So in terms of actions, they seem escalatory to the Iranians, and the Iranians in return, and they're saying they're not sure they want to attend the peace negotiations. I think there's absolute mistrust on both sides. And as you say, not a single LNG vessel has actually moved through during this entire process. And yet the market seems to be constantly anticipating and expecting there to be a ceasefire and a resumption of trade flows. What's clear is that it's just a bit of a fog. So what's clear is that everything is unclear. And I think you've done some modeling work to try and help sharpen people's views. I've used the model. It did help push me to adopt a position and to play around with what will happen on the diplomatic side as well as what's happening on the sort of physical infrastructure side, and to see how those two things interact. So maybe you can tell us a bit more about your model and how you've played some scenarios through it.
Yeah, absolutely. So the reason I made this model was because one of the main questions I'm being asked by subscribers is what's going to happen not only with all of the Middle East constraints that are withholding LNG volumes from the market, but also this big wave of supply, new supply that's going to be added to the market over the next 5 years. How do those two things interact? When will one offset the other? Is the LNG glut big enough to offset the kind of loss of Hormuz volumes? Well, it depends on so many factors, like the diplomacy we're talking about. How long is Hormuz offline for? When it comes back, to what extent is it constrained? So I made a model, and you can essentially go in there and configure it exactly how you want. You can do an infinite number of configurations. I have just produced a YouTube walkthrough video that explains in depth how it works to readers. And so I'll put a link to that in the show notes in the newsletter. But basically it's a model which seeks to plot how much capacity is currently offline from the closure of Hormuz, and you can decide, you can plot, you can say, okay, from X date in the future, I think we're going to have a resumption of Hormuz flows only at like 20% constraint only 20% of the vessels that could leave do leave. And then it ramps up to full reopening in another date in the future. And they're all infinitely configurable. And there are other variables like how long does it really take Qatar Energy to repair the 2 liquefaction trains at Ras Laffan that were damaged by Iranian bomb strikes in March. Those account for about nearly 13 million tons per annum of capacity. They said it could take between 3 and 5 years. Well, you can choose any time you want in the model. It defaults to about 4 years, the midpoint. So you can choose when do those volumes come back online. Also, Qatar's mega expansion, the North Field expansion project, which is nominally supposed to be coming online at some point early in 2027. You can change that in the model. But more significantly, or equally significantly, is that I've also added every single new LNG supply project that is on the roster to be built and start producing over the next 5 years. And they're all infinitely configurable as well. So you can go in and see the default settings for, Corpus Christi, stage 5 train, whatever. And then you can model different scenarios when every single project will come online. When does it produce first LNG? How long does it take to ramp up? So you can change all the individual project settings, and you can do a kind of universal delay factor. So if you think the whole LNG global supply wave would be delayed by 6 months, you can punch that in. Or you think it'll be accelerated in response to what's happening, you can punch that in. And the outputs are really interesting because it essentially plots how much supply are we gaining and how much supply are we losing, and what's the net balance over the next 5 years, both on a nominal capacity basis, so like the million tons per annum of annualized capacity that is lost, gained, and net, and then also on a kind of cumulative supply basis, because the capacity runs out at a certain utilization, and so it's like how many molecules has the market lost on a net basis, because obviously every day that Hormuz is closed, you're running a deeper and deeper and deeper deficit of actual molecules, physical molecules, not just capacity. But then as new projects come online, they ramp up, they start to produce more and more and more. So the question is kind of when do those two intersect? And depending on all those criteria that the users can define and put into the model, you get these very interesting dates around the capacity, new capacity offsetting shut-in capacity, and new cumulative supply volumes offsetting the lost cumulative supply that's been shut in since the 1st of March 2026. And I did write a long deep dive, and hopefully most listeners have already read that, which kind of explains the base case and my sort of pessimistic and optimistic scenarios. But again, I'll put a note in the show notes to link to that piece too, so people can read more about it, and of course to the YouTube walkthrough. But I'm pleased that you were able to take a look at that, Vic, and you've been kind of playing around with it and produced some scenarios of your own. So you want to talk us through those scenarios that you produced?
Yeah, I mean, it was really it was quite fun to see what happens. And I think before I jump into my scenarios, I just very quickly want to talk about the sort of prevailing optimism that we're seeing from industry about the conflict and from the market in terms of pricing. And I think, Seb, it would be interesting to get your sense on what pricing is indicating at the moment in terms of market sentiment. But I did do some reading just to bring some numbers to the podcast so that people can get a sense of why and I think you are a little bit more pessimistic about the chances for a positive diplomatic outcome in the short term that might lead to a partial and then full reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. And one of the most interesting facts I came across, and this is work by The Economist, which says that across 9 Middle East ceasefires since 2020, not one has resulted in a total cessation of violence. And I think one thing that your model, which covers an awful lot of parameters, but one thing, and no model can cover everything, that it doesn't include is the kind of like sentiment of shippers and of the insurance industry. And again, it would be interesting to get your sense of what kind of conditions would actually need to be on the ground for ships to start moving through, for insurers to say, yeah, we're going to insure your cargo. So yeah, not a single Middle East ceasefire since 2020 has resulted in a total cessation of violence. Is that good enough for LNG carriers to start going through this strait? What do you think?
That's quite a data point to really consider, because the shipping industry, it doesn't have the highest risk tolerance. And one of the major factors that constrained shipments along the Hormuz Strait after the outbreak of violence was not the fact that ships were actually being fired upon. It was just this perception that they would be or they could be. And the withdrawal of insurance policies or the crippling in insurance premiums charged by the brokers, which rendered those shipments unfeasible. And so it was more the fear and the risk that constrained the outflows to begin with. And as I've been commenting recently, I was on Al Jazeera recently, and I just told them it looks like regime change is off the table, if indeed it ever really was a realistic proposition beyond something that Benjamin Netanyahu just dreamed up and convinced Trump to go along with. Without regime change, then we have got this sort of Damocles hanging over the strait. So under those conditions, how much LNG can you really expect to exit from the Middle East through that choke point? And I have tried to incorporate that into the model. There are these two variables. One is an initial reopening date where you can constrain the outflows to like 10% or 20%, which could be a kind of partial experimental foray into this brave new world of Iranian control over the Hormuz. And then from that date, from let's say 20% outflows from say the 1st of May, the model then gets a gradiated increase up to full reopening whenever you choose that date to be. And that for me, that's a kind of proxy for the shipping industry gradually becoming more confident that shipping can resume and can continue through Hormuz. And so in my base case scenario, I have, I think, only 10% resumption of flows through Hormuz on the 1st of September this year. And then full resumption flows, I think it's midway through 2028. So there's a very gradual ramp up as confidence slowly builds back in the market. I described it I was on a call recently. I described it with an audience that it's like your reputation. You can take a lifetime to build it and then ruin it in an instant. Well, I think confidence over the safety, security, and economic viability of Hormuz as a shipping lane, it's been built up over years and it's been ruined in an instant. So, how long will it take for that confidence to come back? My base case is going to take a very long time, even if you do get a partial resumption of flows, which, like I said, is ingrained in the base case of the model. I think you're going to see this very slow resumption back up to what was anything resembling pre-war levels.
Very interesting. And I think, so it's one thing is what the wider context requires in terms of getting energy flowing again through the strait. And I think the other thing that stood out to me in the last week was a quote by Scott Sheffield, one of the US oil and gas industry's long-standing leaders. He said that Trump had to solve the problem of the strait to protect the world economy from higher oil prices. And his specific quote is, "We can't let the mullahs control with tolls the Strait of Hormuz. It's got to be probably a joint force with Europe and with Asia eventually to open that up, and with the other Persian Gulf countries." And then he went further and said that the US should do everything it can to control the strait with joint forces, even if it meant putting troops on the ground around the strait. And I read that and thought, wow, that's an extraordinary quote from an oil and gas industry leader. And maybe he's just the only one that's saying that. Maybe that's just an isolated view, or maybe he's saying out the silent part that no one else feels comfortable saying. But then further down, and this was an interview in the FT, further down, the head of the API, the American Petroleum Institute, echoed those sentiments and said that everything possible needed to be done to reopen the Strait of Hormuz and end the war. And that included that boots on the ground may be necessary. So, to the extent that people feel like the oil industry or the oil lobby in DC is influential, it's worth noting that some parts of that lobby and some parts of the industry are saying that the worst outcome is a permanent cost for transmitting the strait. So I think that it's interesting to not just imagine what's happening in Tehran and in Islamabad, but also what's happening in DC, and that there is just so many moving pieces to this piece. And at the moment, we're not in a de-escalatory phase. We're in an escalatory phase, in my view. And that we probably haven't yet reached the peak of the crisis, because, as I said, with the ship being seized within the last few days, that's an action speaks louder than words moment for the Iranian government. And I think there is, as I said earlier, deep mistrust. The last two times that they've entered into negotiation, I think they've had the Israelis bomb them. Last time they've negotiated with the US government. So it's really tough to see how, on the diplomatic side, things might get resolved as quickly as people seem to think it might. But what's happening in the market, Seb? What's happening with prices? Do you think the market reflects that, what I'm saying, or is it a different story entirely?
Well, as we've detailed in previous episodes, the market has really struggled to reflect adequately all these all these many moving parts. And really, like, the price on the front month for natural gas in Europe is a kind of expression of a balance of probabilities over binary outcomes. So I think by its very nature, it's never going to reflect real world outcomes, because reality is never a balance of probabilities. And so it's been moving in sympathy with oil. We have seen, well, obviously there was this kind of Schrodinger's Strait moment at the end of last week, where the Strait is open, the Strait's not open. Obviously, big sell-off in oil, big sell-off in gas, and then when markets opened on Monday after the seizure of an Iranian ship, then prices start rallying again. TTF is up, I think last time I checked, about 43 euros per megawatt hour, which is not very much above where it was on the first Monday after the bombs started falling. So the risk premium, a lot of it sold off. The wartime profiteering of US LNG projects has evaporated much faster than I anticipated. And there's this weird situation where, like, the investment funds who make speculative bets on TTF gas futures shot up to their biggest net long position, their biggest bullish bet that prices will rise ever in the history of TTF trading. I think it was 320 something terawatt hours of net long positions in TTF gas futures, which is just an extraordinary amount of gas. Obviously, it's not real gas, not real molecules. These are kind of quote unquote paper molecules, but it's a bet that the price will go up. And they then quickly backpedaled from that as this jawboning of the market has been proven quite effective to bring oil down, and gas moves down in sympathy. So we've seen a lot of short covering on the way back down again. And now there's this deep uncertainty about where the price will go next, and everything seems to be hanging on the next Truth Social post, the next, does the plane depart from Washington kind of social media headline, and who's on it, trying to read between the lines about whether it's, is JD Vance on the flight, or is it going to be like Witkoff and Kushner, because it could mean that the Iranians won't negotiate with them, and the market's trying to like price in these finicky political details into like the price of a commodity. There's no way it could possibly reflect fair value. And I'm actually working on a new piece in Energy Flux that looks to quantify the difference between the fair value price of gas and the discount that's being applied due to this false optimism that we see in these prices moving downwards. So that's going to come out in the next sort of week or so. But just going back to your Scott Sheffield quote, this idea that the US oil and gas industry, the fracking industry, can't tolerate Iranian sovereign control of the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, I read that as meaning if Iran literally does manage to cement its control over Hormuz on a permanent or semi-permanent basis, then that gives them immense power over the market, and by extension over the economic outlook for the US fracking industry, because they can at will release and withhold not just their own volumes, but all of the Gulf producers, minus what they're able to kind of scurry out through other pipelines that go to non-Hormuz dependent pathways to get to global markets, which is pretty limited capacity. The vast majority of upstream Gulf production has to come through Hormuz, and although more pipelines will be built, and if Iran does manage to cement its control over Hormuz, there will be efforts to try to mitigate that by getting the oil and gas out through other means. The fact remains that it's still going to be subject to Iranian control. And what does that mean? Well, I read that as being like OPEC essentially dies, because OPEC quotas have always, there's always been this problem around OPEC because, compliance, OPEC agrees to withhold X number of barrels at the next meeting, but who's really complying? And all these backroom deals that are trying to reconcile competing perspectives over producer demands to increase production when they shouldn't really be doing it. None of that counts, because if Saudi Arabia says we're going to increase supply and Iran says you can't use the Strait of Hormuz, then OPEC's bargaining power and the weight that the market attaches to its words suddenly collapses. And so that means that Iran has control over pricing in a way that could deteriorate the economics of, for example, drilling new wells in the Permian, because when you want to deploy multi-million-dollar rigs, then you need to have some sort of clarity over, what the netbacks will be, what the profitability of that investment will be for shareholders. And if the price is essentially beholden to an extent by the control of shipping through the Hormuz, and it's the Islamic regime in Tehran, then that completely destroys your confidence in your ability to deploy shareholder capital profitably into new drilling. So that's why Scott Sheffield is so petrified, and he would rather see American troops on the ground and presumably put in harm's way. And you would imagine there to be human casualties, lots of collateral damage, human damage as a result, just to essentially protect the US oil and gas industry, which is quite an interesting ethical position.
Yeah, I mean, just a point here on OPEC and on narratives. It is a bit of an existential crisis for OPEC, this whole scenario. If you look at the front page of their website, there's a nice little video about how petroleum products make space exploration possible. And then the top item, again on the homepage in the Secretary General's corner, is, does the fossil fuel label require a rethink? Which is a sort of strange thought piece on should we call oil, gas and coal something other than fossil fuels. And then obviously they're doing their routine press releases and all the rest of it, but it's basically keeping stum on the entire crisis. And presumably that's because the crisis cracks through the heart of OPEC, and it's very hard for OPEC to take a position on this. So that's an interesting side point. Yeah, and the other side point is around winners and losers. And I think we could do an entire separate episode. I know you've written about this, about the extent to which the market is being manipulated, but also it's interesting to look at who, in terms of producers, has done very well out of the conflict. Again, you've written about this, but also who hasn't done so well. My sort of bird's eye view of this is that the traders, who normally do quite well in scenarios of volatility, haven't done as well as the majors who are closer to the production side of things. So you asked me earlier about my three scenarios, and I think I've waited long enough. I will explain them in detail now. And what we're going to do is plug them into the energy flux model. But more importantly, we're going to ask folks, listeners, readers, and others to vote on which of the three scenarios they find the most plausible, because we want to see what the wider world and what people are thinking. So scenario 1 is Independence Day. That's the short-term scenario. It's called Independence Day because this year is the 250th anniversary of the creation of America, and Donald Trump will be president, and there'll be a lot of cameras on him, and a lot of those clips will presumably be shared for posterity. So I suspect that Independence Day, always a big day, always a big thing, 4th of July in the US, but I think this year is going to be bigger and louder than normal, and I assume that he wants people to be happy for it. So we're kind of on a short-term scenario. We're assuming that there'll be a partial reopening 2 weeks prior to the 4th of July, and then a full opening 2 weeks before the midterms. Yeah, that's scenario number 1.
Okay. Independence Day, partial reopening of the Strait of Hormuz 2 weeks prior to the 4th of July. Presumably he's going to have to make some concessions and expend a bit of political capital to enable that to happen. And then especially to get full reopening of Hormuz just 2 weeks before the midterms. That sounds like quite a tall order.
Yes, it's a very optimistic scenario, but for anyone who's a fan of the film Independence Day from the 1990s, in this scenario, he makes a big speech on the 4th of July and says this is a new Independence Day for the whole world, and it's the day we all got our energy back.
Okay, what's scenario 2? Go on then.
Scenario 2 is that the Hormuz dominates the US primaries. So as soon as the midterms are over, there'll be a short break, and then people will start thinking about what happens when Trump leaves office. And there's the primaries where the two main parties will pick their candidates. So in this scenario, the Iranians are very much seeing that they can have an influence on the election because of the gasoline price in the US. And they're going to make sure that it's one of the most talked about subjects in the US. So in this scenario, there'll be a partial reopening in January 2028. And a year later, a full opening in January 2029.
Wow, that would be painful for the entire world economy. Like if there's like zero transits through Hormuz or next to zero, then you can just imagine there being probably a global recession between now and January 2028. So that is a pretty strong assertion of Iranian sovereignty to the extent that it's like dominating the news agenda during the electoral cycle. So yeah, okay, interesting. That's your second scenario. And what's your third scenario then?
So scenario 3 is that the Iranians are really dug in, and I think they've proven themselves thus far to be more resilient than anyone had anticipated. So in this scenario, they've been running a war economy for the entire period all the way. What they're holding out for is a post-Trump world. So in this scenario, there's going to be a partial reopening in November 2028. And that's roughly the time when the next US president will be picked. and then they will do a full reopening on inauguration day in January 2029. So in this scenario, the Iranians are very much using their control of energy flows to make it utterly clear that Trump is the last person they will negotiate with, that they have no trust in him, and that they will hold out for anyone else.
That's really something to behold. So it's kind of like ultimate trolling. The minute there's a changing of the guard, we let the LNG out.
Maximum trolling, yeah.
Okay, all right. So we've got Independence Day optimism, Hormuz dominating the US primaries, that's a pretty pessimistic case in its own right, because there's like no LNG flowing out of Hormuz until January 2028, and then like waiting for a post-Trump world, which I think kind of captures this dynamic where it's the situation around the US and Iran is it's a war of attrition, but it's economic attrition, because there's no kinetic violent action at the moment, thank goodness, and touch wood there won't be, but they seem to be trying to suss out how long the other can withstand the blockade. On the Iranian side, the loss of oil revenue, and on the American side, the political capital that's being expended. I mean, if the Iranians can survive until November 2028 without letting any cargoes through the Strait of Hormuz, then I don't think they would actually have to wait that long. So I think Trump might be out before November 2028. So maybe we should have a regime change like in the US scenario. But let's leave it at that. We've got Iranians wait for post-Trump world as your third scenario. I absolutely love it. Like Vic said, we're going to plug these into the model. We're going to model what it means for the LNG complex, the supply ramp up. And remember, of course, you've got that supply coming on stream. So it'd be interesting to understand in different political scenarios that could affect LNG supply outflows through Hormuz. We can then tell listeners, with all the other projects being ramped up in the US and elsewhere, like just how long or how soon it would take for new LNG supply to offset the lost volumes and lost capacity that's trapped behind the Hormuz choke points. So we'll put a poll in the newsletter. We will share the results on the next episode of the podcast, and we'll also tell you what these scenarios actually mean, like how good or how bad it could get on the supply side of the equation for the LNG industry, and by extension, the entire natural gas world, and, carbon pricing and coal to gas switching, industrial competitiveness in Europe. All these things hinge upon the reopening and the timeframe for resuming Hormuz outflows and the ramp up of LNG projects globally. So I'm quite looking forward. I'd be quite curious to see as well how listeners vote on that. Are people optimistic? Do they think Trump can pull a rabbit out of the hat in time for the 250th anniversary of the founding of the United States? Or do they see the Iranians winning the war of attrition and waiting until November 2028 to resume flows? Very interesting. Thank you very much, Vic, for taking the time to walk us through those very interesting scenarios.
Yeah, no worries. I mean, I think, on some level, it's all a bit of fun, but it is interesting to see both the quotes that I shared earlier, as well as the statistics around ceasefires and how much they hold. And then, as you point out, that for the Iranians, their current position of power over the Straits may prove to be so unshakable that it still feels like we don't really know where this is all going to end up. That the range of possibilities remain too broad for anyone to really capture the diplomatic outcome. It's going to be very interesting to see. I think that the divergence and the gap between what the US wants and what the Iranians want, never mind what everyone else wants, which is also extremely relevant, is so vast that we're still nowhere really, I think, near a resolution. And I think there's more. There's more to come. We have yet to reach the peak.
You're absolutely right. And I thought that I would just load up the news headlines while you were just speaking there. And I've got some breaking news for you. I don't know if you've seen this. Trump has extended a US ceasefire at the behest of Pakistan, but he'll continue the blockade of Iranian ports. So that's literally breaking news from the last sort of 15 or 20 minutes. Just a reminder, this is the 21st of April, 2026. And what just happened, I'm reading off the Reuters front page, Trump's indefinitely extended the ceasefire with Iran before it was set to expire to allow the two countries to continue peace talks. He said he agreed to a request by Pakistan, which has mediated the peace talks. And it's like the latest taco. Of course, Trump always chickens out. And he's obviously made repeated threats to bomb power plants and other civilian infrastructure. Well, obviously, he's doing whatever it takes not to do that. He's clearly averse to deepening the the military confrontation, but they'll keep the blockade up because I think he's realized, he's probably learning from the Iranians just how effective a blockade can be, inflicting economic pain on your adversary without having to put lives, bodies, and expensive munitions in harm's way. So there you go. It's like we're almost back to square one. It's this Mexican standoff in the Middle East, zero visibility over what's going to happen. But what is clear is that there aren't going to be many ships going through the Strait of Hormuz.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to see that it's a continuation of the current system. I do think the other thing that I picked up on is that he's spoken about the fractured leadership in Iran, and I guess he's discovering that if you bomb everyone, it doesn't leave many people to negotiate with, or it leaves too many people to negotiate without it being clear who's actually in charge. So I think, yeah, it's a continuation of the status quo, as you said. How and when things resolve is unclear. And I think we'll probably be back here again by the time we get the votes in on which scenario people want us to model, without things necessarily having changed much. It seems that J.D. Vance didn't think it was worth him departing for Islamabad, so he stayed in Washington. So, yeah, back to square one.
We are, aren't we? And I think your point about killing all of the leadership is really interesting, because I referred to this kind of Schrodinger's Strait situation where the strait was open, the strait was closed. What we saw was like what remains of the political elite in Tehran making a declaration about the strait being open, being overridden by the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, who are essentially the guys who hold the guns, and them asserting themselves and saying, no, we're not going to let ships through, even though what remains of the kind of political leadership is questioning that it remains open. So you're seeing a hardening in the Iranian position and power shift within Iran towards those more hardliner elements who are not willing to do any deals with the Americans whatsoever. So not only have the Americans precipitated the closure of Hormuz, they've also created the conditions in which it will be almost impossible to convince Iran to open them by assassinating all of these senior leaders. So the lack of strategic planning is just like plain for all to see. And as a result, markets, the industry, everybody really is just left staring into this abyss of deep and growing uncertainty over what is going to happen.
Yeah, just to tack back on your point on the blockade. So the shipping industry, this is another quote that I picked up on. When the US initially put its blockade in place, the shipping industry immediately came out and called this essentially a double blockade. So completely suboptimal for them as well as for everyone else. And I think the final thing I'm going to leave for listeners with is another quote, and it's "Wars begin when you will, but they do not end when you please," and that's Niccolo Machiavelli. And I think this continuation of the ceasefire is a sign that Trump wants peace, but he can't get it on the terms that he wants. And that's the thing. You can start a fight, but you don't get to pick when it ends. And I think Trump is beginning to discover that. I think this continuation of the ceasefire is a sign that he wants peace. He's not, despite what he said mere hours ago about continuing the bombing campaign or restarting the bombing campaign, he wants peace, but he cannot get a peace on the terms that he wants. And this is the issue. He did not think enough. No one thought enough about the off-ramps for this round of conflict.
Yeah, I have this image of like two race cars racing down a racetrack towards this war scenario, and there are off ramps, but to get off the off ramp on the motorway, you have to go over these red lines. You know, they've all got, each side has to cross a red line to get to the off ramp, and nobody's prepared to do that. They're just bombing towards this endless confrontation. And I suspect, like you say, we'll be in that place next week, hopefully, if we find time to record the next episode of the podcast and come back with the results of the poll, the results of the modelling run. It's going to be very interesting, but I think we are in for the long haul on Hormuz and everything that implies. So all that remains is for me to thank you, Vic.
Thank you.
And thank you, everyone, for listening. You're listening to the Energy Flux podcast. And if you're not already signed up, then go over to www.energyflux.news, sign up for the free newsletter, check out the deep dives, the chart deck. And if you take out a paid subscription, you can get access to the Hormuz supply model, which you can, like I said, plug in all of your own scenarios and figure out how the supply side and Middle East interruptions affect the outlook for LNG supply over the next 5 years. It's been quite fun to build it, even more fun to play around with it. And I love your scenarios, Vic. So I look forward to sharing them on the next episode. So thank you for listening, and I'll see you again soon.